What does it mean to exist? It's a fundamental question that scholars, poets, philosophers, and scientists alike have pondered over centuries. Existence is a tricky thing because it's largely shaped by perception. But ask anyone who's been Black anywhere in the world, what you perceive isn't always what's real. Take this studio, for example. We've got mics, armchairs, wicker walls, lighting. All of that creates the illusion of a lush and homey space. But when you pan out, you can see all these mechanizations that go into creating that image for you and all the other images it makes. Because zooming out allows you to explore all that exists beyond what your eyes can perceive. To explore this further, I'm joined by Hakeem Oluseyi, who is the host of Particles of Thought, brought to you by the producers at Nova, and the author of the new book, Why Do We Exist? So let's get to the root of it. I'm Paris Alston, and this is Rooted. So, Hakeem, in this book, you explore the 9 realms of the universe that make us possible.
Yes.
Help me explain what realm we're in right now, because we just went from one part of the studio to the other, but we're still in the same space.
Right, yeah, so when you look at the universe, size matters, scale matters, right? And so there are many scales of size, and there are scales of energy, and there are scales of emergence. So I define where we are as the middle realm. And this is the realm where our intuition actually works. And the thing that you learn when you start studying the universe is that your intuition fails you.
Really? You're always told the opposite, though.
Well, you're right? But this is absolutely true. But just take an example from history. Aristotle's physics, right, the Greek philosopher, it lasted for hundreds of years, right, for centuries, because it was consistent with everything we observe, right? If I push something, it always comes to a stop. And so it was Galileo who realized that the way to truth, the deepest levels of truth, for one thing, there's the requirement that we only accept in the physical world what is true based on what is observed to be true, right? If you observe it to be true, then you can say it's true. If you haven't observed it to be true, you can't observe it to be true, right? But that gave us Aristotle's physics. But then Galileo thought, what if I do a mental experiment that could never be done in real life? Like, what if I removed all friction? What would happen then, right? You can't do that experiment. And he realized that if you removed all friction, objects would never come to rest, right? So he was like, whoa, an object at rest or in motion remains at rest or in motion.
Exactly.
Unless,
Which is a theory that we kind of all know and operate on today.
Exactly.
So in the book, you talk about this concept of swag, which you define as a scientific wild-ass guess, right? Which is, I think we all take many of those each and every day. How does that differ from a hypothesis or a scientific theory like what you're describing? Yeah,
so there is a pre-existing body of knowledge, and sometimes you have to extrapolate from that with a hypothesis, right? But when you're a scientist and you put forward a hypothesis, it really has to be grounded. All right. Now, normally in life, we make wild-ass guesses about things.
All the time, right?
So a scientific wild-ass guess is a little less than a hypothesis, but more than just a wild-ass guess, right? So it's like I have synthesized information. I don't know this to be true, but seems like it could work.
Okay, can I give you a really great example of this? I don't know if you've seen the clip that's been floating around of Kevin Gates from this 2022 interview he did with academics. And in the interview, he talked about how he saw this lady on the side of the road. Her car broke down because her battery had died, but they didn't have any jumper cables. So he put his hands on the battery and said that the power of God helped him to charge the battery with his bare hands. And then he went on to try to justify this by saying that we have electric currents that run through our body.
Okay.
I'm like, is this one of the wildest scientific
no, that's just a wild-ass guess. That is not, there's no scientific there. But the thing is, he's right, right? There are electric currents.
And you talk about this in the realm of life, when you describe the realm of life in the book.
That's right, that's right. And the realm of life, when you look at the physical universe, the middle realm I define as anything bigger than an atom. Below that, you're in a quantum realm. And anything bigger than around 20,000 light years, the size of a galactic arm. Above that, you're in the cosmological realm. But within the realm of life, there are these two realms that are so profound that they need their own separate realms. And that is the realm of life that you just mentioned. Because if you look at everything else that's going on in the universe, life is kind of doing the opposite of that,
yes.
right? And the other one is where I complete the book, is the realm of imagination. These brains that we have, you know, like I look at deep history a lot, and I look at human history a lot, not just the history of the universe and the planet, and I am so impressed by this ape. That was just yesterday in the Stone Age, and now we're sitting here with, you know, smartphones. We're going to the moon. You know, we've created this technological civilization, and we so take it for granted that we expect that someone else has done it. Hey, look, the aliens have come to visit us.
Some of us are wishing they would hurry up and come and take a little bit quicker.
Beam me up, Scotty.
I want to get to that a little bit later, but I also want to talk to you about the way that you've approached writing this book, because I know you really want to make what you do accessible, especially to people who don't necessarily see themselves, but they see you and they may see themselves in you.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, there are parts of this book that are kind of dense, right? When you're explaining it here to me now, it feels relatable, but for the average kid, maybe who is entering this and saying, okay, I'm interested in this, is this really accessible to them?
Well, listen, I utilize the Parliament Funkadelic approach to my science communication.
Okay, George Clinton.
That's right. Make my funk the P-Funk. I like my funk uncut.
Put me on a spaceship.
Yeah, right. So when they said P-Funk, they meant the pure funk. Now, of course, they were talking about drugs, but I'm talking about knowledge, right? And I think that people are, you know, it's like when you have a child. If you don't ask it of them, they're not going to give it to you. And if you ask them to reach, they're going to reach and they're going to achieve it. So, you know, I do write it in very accessible language, but there are just certain topics that you can't. And I remember, you know, I left Mississippi, you know, working class community, and find myself in Stanford University for graduate school in physics. And they felt like they were speaking a completely different language as far as I was concerned. And I was like, why are they speaking this weird language? Why don't they just talk regular, right? But then later, by being embedded in that environment, of course I caught on. Human brains are great, right? We can do that. And then I was like, oh, thank you for not doing that. So the thing that people say to me often is, oh, Hakeem, thank you for dumbing it down for me, or dumbing it down for us. And I say, no, you have a misunderstanding. I'm dumb too, right? I'm telling you the way I understand it.
I see.
And I don't think in jargon and these words that you hear professionals use.
Do you think that would change if the audience for scientific discussion was reimagined altogether?
Well, that's what I'm doing. I'm helping to create it, right? This book is also an invitation. So because we've hit a point now where fundamentally there haven't been really big changes in our understanding of the universe in a while. Definitely not in this century, the 21st century. And there comes a time when you can only do so much observation, measurement, and calculation, and you have to employ imagination. And the hive mind of humanity is ultra powerful. So I'm inviting the readers into this. Is not, hey, I'm the scientist, let me tell you what is. It's kind of like, yo, I need your help. And in order for you to be the most capable of helping me, let me tell you everything up front and set it up for you so now you can join me.
I see. And you also, I mean, you start off this book talking about a very accessible scientific thing that we all do every day, which is just looking up at the sky.
Absolutely.
Right? And observing all of the amazing things that are happening there. But I think about the kid, you know, who maybe grew up in some life circumstances similar to yours, because I know they were very dynamic and traumatic for you. And I think about the kid who may be going through that experience and looking up at the sky, but not knowing how to take that wonder and amazement to the next level.
Right. Yeah.
How do you reach them?
You know, so in my case, you know, I did have a traumatic childhood, and whereas most humans bond with other humans, I bonded with books, right? That was my escape from the danger and the world that I was in. And that world of wonder, you know, children live in that world of wonder. And so I tried to write it somewhat cinematically, paint these pictures so that the universe becomes a movie in your mind and not just a series of facts, right? And the other thing is that who is the deliverer of the story matters. The language that you use matters. Just being a Southerner, right? You know, like people vibe with me from that aspect. Also being African American, also being, you know, raised by Richard Pryor and Eddie Murphy, right? You know, all of that matters. And so when I ever sit down to do science communication, the very first thing I think about is connecting with my fellow human. If I don't establish that connection, then you're not going to be receptive and I'm not going to be effective. So I'm all about connecting.
And I know early in your career you were kind of branding yourself as the gangster astronomer.
That wasn't me. That wasn't me.
Tell me more. Why wasn't it you?
So what happened is I had worked in Africa for a decade, all right? And then 2009 was the anniversary of Galileo, you know, using a telescope astronomically for the first time in 1609. So it was the International Year of Astronomy. And I'd already been working in Africa. And so these things called Galileo scopes were given out all around the world. And they were useless. And I found it offensive. Okay. At the same time, astronomy was moving into a new era. We had made bigger and bigger and bigger telescopes, which meant that those really big telescopes can't look at the nearby bright universe. They have to look at very distant things. And so once we opened up a new window of time, right, where we're discovering new planets, we do that by making observations over time, right? And so, you know, anything that's changing in the universe. What happened is, suddenly, you didn't need a big telescope. You just needed a small telescope, okay? So I thought, how can I get a bunch of telescopes in the Southern Hemisphere? And I heard the story of this gentleman who worked for the Innocence Project who gave a TED Talk, and the audience gave him like millions of dollars that afternoon. And I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll give a TED Talk, and you know, and they'll give me money to fund this project. And what happened is my pathway to get into TED Talk was to apply to become a TED Fellow. And then they're like, oh, Hakeem, you're interesting. Let's write a story about you. So I gave them a little hints of my background, and they titled the story, Rise of a Gangster Nerd.
Oh,
yeah, which I didn't see the title. Yeah, so of course, at first I'm like, what are they doing, right? And then another organization, Ozzy, which no longer exists, but they wrote an article about me titled The Gangster Physicist, right? So people looked at my background because I did do gangster things, right?
I mean, we all have in some way or another.
Background.
But we ain't here to talk about none of that.
We got skeletons in our closet. Yeah, but I'm like, that's not, you know, it's not like I'm walking around the lab beating people up and selling drugs anymore. Right? Yeah. And so that's where that originated. And what happened is right after that happened, I was invited to give a talk in a prison. All right, and they wanted to hear from the gangster physicist. And what I did not know is that the Anti-Recidivism Coalition had been using those articles to inspire inmates. And after I spent that day in that prison, Ironwood State Prison in Southern California, it was run by Scott Butkin, who's an executive producer of the Hangover movies, right? He was the president of the Anti-Recidivism Coalition. You know, they were like, you're the only speaker that the inmates requested, which did not make it a more attractive option for me. but after I saw the impact that name had, I said, okay, I'll accept it, right? Because what I've always wanted to do is to impact people's lives positively.
100%. And from that point forth, I mean, even though you reluctantly embraced this identity, what did it teach you about the parts of your identity that you would adjust going forward and the parts that were absolutely non-negotiable?
Well, man, so when I stepped into this new world, there were parts of me that I was like, I will never speak of this. You know, I'd lived a secret life my entire life, right? I started selling drugs with my dad at 9 years old, right? So I had these parts of me. And not only that, I talked different, right? I was right out of Mississippi. If I were to take you there today, where I'm from, you wouldn't understand half the people when they speak. And no one understood me. So I had to change the way I speak. And so there were parts of me that I felt like I had to suppress. But then, as I became as I began to advance in my career, and I found myself in mentorship positions quite often, and I found people reaching out to me to tell me the impact I was having on them, I began to realize that those elements that I was keeping hidden were the actual superpowers that I had. Those things are what allowed me to be more effective. And so, you know, I stopped doing that. And you know, when I wrote my memoir, I just laid myself bare in all of the, you know, things that, people want to keep hitting no matter who you are, right? And again, a month before the book came out, I was in a little panic internally thinking, what have I done? But then again, it was the same reception. People saw themselves in it and they realized, and it helped them, and I tell you, I don't have time to go over all the things people have said to me in terms of how it's impacted them and allowed them to change their life. But I tell you, man, I feel like, I grew up in the church down in Mississippi, and I forget the exact statement, but it's something like God used me, or
Yeah, I mean, well, I think by sharing your story, it's a form of mentorship to people you may never even meet, right? Like they can see you and see your work and be inspired by that, but it gives them the tools that they need to kind of move forward. And I think this is especially important too when we see that Black faculty or Black scientists, right, are not as abundant as we wish they were, right? And you had mentorship from people like,
absolutely.
Renowned physicist Arthur B.C. Walker Jr.
That's right.
And others. But how do we really scale that? How do we really inspire younger people to see themselves if that's not present?
Man, I often say this, and it's a hard thing. But I feel that in order to educate the children, you have to educate the adults. Because long before they step foot into a classroom, right, a culture is being created around these elements about where do I fit? What is cool? What is interesting? And, when you go to school, right, an example I give is I went to a little high school in Mississippi. My high school graduating class was around 70 students, right? And we had coaches. They did football at a high level, right? They did college football. They were good at it. What's the probability that my physics teacher was ever a physicist, or my biology teacher was ever a biologist, or my chemistry teacher was ever a chemist? It's under 10% probably, right? They go to school to learn this thing called education, right? And so that impacts how they're able to reach the student, right? So, instead of being like, I've been a physicist, I know what you need to get you there, right? They're getting these government mandated NGSS education goals, and having been a part of that ecosystem, it is not the most efficient way to get you there. And in many cases, I feel like, especially mathematically, we are miseducated first, all of us, right? And it's just a few of us that get lucky enough. For me, it happened in the Navy. Right? I didn't learn algebra well. It's not like I didn't have an algebra course in my high school in Mississippi, but it did not result in me learning algebra, especially what is needed. So by going into the military, who takes people from all walks of life and turn them into the people who operate the biggest, most dangerous equipment in the world, right? And they do it successfully, I applied that training to academia because it's so much more effective.
Absolutely. And what advice would you give to parents who maybe they don't know how to open that access up to their children?
Yeah. That's a tough thing because research has shown over and over that the people who become a particular thing, especially in science, are the ones who have access to the people who do it. Yeah. Right. And so not only that, right? If you go to your physics class, the second I tell someone I'm a physicist, the first thing they say is, I hated my physics class, right? That's the case for many people, That's how I feel about organic chemistry. I hated it. So what advice I would give to parents, today is a different world. The internet is there, but the human interaction is the most important. And so, my mom, when she knew that I had this interest, on only 2 occasions, she met an engineer. She's like, talk to my son. And that happens to me all the time. People are like, talk to my kid. And I do, right? I do it. And so find a way to interact with the human.
And a lot of times, kids are doing this on the internet now, right? Like, to your point, it's way more accessible than ever to find anybody who may be a scientist or may not be a scientist talking about science. So there's that misinformation piece that we really have to worry about because kids are so impressionable. Young people are so impressionable. Adults are so impressionable.
And naive. And,
exactly. And have confirmation bias and all the other things. And so how do we continue to open this world up and make it more accessible digitally while
Right.
making sure that people have the tools to be discerning?
Yeah, oh, you have some tough questions. that is tough. Like the discerning element of it makes it really difficult, and because you don't know what you don't know. That's why
Right.
it's easy to be taken, right? And to be guided down a path.
And
that
to be
is not
waiting
gonna-
for the aliens who may never be coming.
Speaking of which, I was doing an alien interview not long ago, and they were asking me about something. I'm like, listen to me. There is nothing that any light could do that would make me say that's aliens. That's a light doing something, right?
I don't know though. The U.S. government be having people thinking all kinds of stuff.
Yeah,
Just saying.
It's true. People are thinking all kinds of stuff in my own house. So yeah. But you know, how do you? The thing about science is that it's not intuitive, and math is something that all of us do, but we don't do the math that's necessary for science, right? And so, you know, we're not introduced to that until we're in our teens or later. And so at that point, we've been miseducated. So as an example, the question I've asked people for like 25 years when I realized that this is how we've been miseducated, I'll ask people, in one word, what is math about? And you can tell how much people have been in the system based on how they answer that question. The vast majority of people are going to answer numbers. Right? But if a person is like me, they'll say logic or reasoning or something like that.
Right.
Because when you're doing mathematics as a scientist or engineer, numbers show up at the last step. Right? In the 15 pages before that, there's not many numbers. And if it is, you know, you're typically adding and multiplying the single-digit numbers, right? You're not doing these math tricks. You know, it's not like that. It's all logic tricks, right? And that transition. You know, and I had the same difficulty, right? I had the same difficulty transitioning. It's like something that's really easy, but when you've started out by becoming miseducated, it is so hard.
I see. So it's important to have those fundamentals.
The fundamentals at the very beginning, right, is what could solve it. But what I'm working on now is intervention. So I now lead America's oldest national astronomy organization. It's called the ASP, the Astronomical Society of the Pacific. I'm renaming it, our current leadership team, the Astro Society. Yeah. But it's also an education organization. And we are now developing exactly those. What we do is we educate educators, right? We educate teachers and informal science educators. So what we're doing now is we're trying to, where we're on the pathway of developing these techniques that you're asking about so that we can intervene at different points and also start people from the very beginning with the right framework so that it becomes super easy. And let me just end with this. But using these methods, I think that the average sixth grader can have the mathematical acumen of a college sophomore.
Wow.
Easily.
Yeah, that's a big jump.
That's a big statement, but it's absolutely what I think and believe.
Well, we'll look forward to seeing that hypothesis tested. So you talk a little bit about the idea of prefrontal synthesis, which is the ability to imagine things that don't exist yet, right? Which is,
man, you really read my book.
Listen, we have a great production team as well that really helps me out. So I got to give them, we share the credit there. But I think we're all doing a lot of this, right? Especially at a time when we're seeing things happen that we didn't think would happen. And so we're all kind of trying to imagine worlds that we can't quite see yet. But there's always this question of who gets access to those things. And I think we're seeing this play out a lot on the world stage or in the global, or in the other world stage where we see people are going to Mars, right? People are literally considering what is our planet B as we confront things like climate change and just, I think, an overall societal lethargy, right? But does everyone have access to that unimagined future?
Wow. So when we talk about this access, typically it's not access to everything. It's really access at that cutting edge, that frontier, that new thing that's emerging, right? And using, again, mathematics as an example, I will say to people, you typically learn mathematics well before you graduate high school in one of two ways. It's in your house or you got lucky. Right? So I'll give you an example. There was a young man I worked with. He's not young anymore. His name is Armin Karcher. He's this German dude. He was an engineer I worked with at Lawrence Berkeley Labs. brilliant dude. And he would drop these things on me. In 2012, he told me to invest in these two little things, NVIDIA and Bitcoin.
I was about to say, I know it was Bitcoin.
Yeah, and NVIDIA.
Please tell me you took his...
No. But even if I had, I would have lost all my wealth in a divorce. So it doesn't matter, right?
Fair.
So, you know, but the point is that I had access to Armin, right? And the same thing happens when, you know, when you're a scientist and say, you know, you do what I've done. Oh, I'm going to go do media. And then I'm going to go back and be a scientist. They say when you leave, you can't come back. Not because you're ignorant, but because you're not current. What was the latest thing? You need to be up on the latest thing that happened yesterday, right? So now everybody's talking about AI. The same people that are talking about AI today, were they talking about in 2012, 2008, right? I was first introduced to it in 2008. And I made it a part of my
Siri
research.
was launched and everybody was asking Siri to do X, Y, and Z, like, hello, we were already, it was already happening then.
So if you look at it relative, you know, the average person in America is living better than a king or queen a few centuries ago, right? But if you look at that cutting edge where the wealth is going to be created, you know, the vast majority of us are living in, you know, 3 years back. Yeah. You know? And so how do you get access? Again, it always comes down to humans. And, you know, I grew up in, you know, so we create these boundaries about ourselves, right? When I grew up in Mississippi, it was totally racially segregated, my world was, right? All black high school from the all white high school. So when I ventured out of that community, I remained somewhat segregated. You know, I sort of like eased my way into getting to know the different cultures of the world, right? And then when I worked in Silicon Valley, at one time I'm the only non-Chinese member of my team. One time I'm the only non-member of my team. One time I'm the only non-Korean of my team. And I realized how all these different cultures are assets. As I get to know these different people, get their knowledge. So the thing to do is spread yourself wide, 100%. Have as many alliances, then you have access to the most knowledge you can gain. But I tell you, you know, the internet and AI are great, but humans are your greatest asset.
A special thank you to Hakeem Oluseyi. His book, Why Do We Exist, is out now, and you can check out his podcast, Particles of Thought, coming out this summer. Thanks so much for tuning in to Rooted. You can click the QR code to keep up with us everywhere you stream or scroll.